One of the greatest national tragedies of the Slavic people was so catastrophic that it was almost forgotten, a tragedy which pushed Slavs too far away from the light of Greco-Roman civilization to be known at all by ancient history. Much was written of their neighbours, the Germans, the Boii, and the Scythians who were later replaced by the Sarmatians, but what was known of those who lay beyond them? In our previous video we covered the origins of the Slavs and the Lusatian culture. Now we will cover its destruction, the decline and re-emergence of the Slavs. Upadnie I wozwrat Slowianów. In the east of Poland and around the Pripyat marshes, around 600 BC we have the emergence of a new Slavic culture, the Milograd culture. This was initially one of the subgroups of the Lusatian culture, which became more and more distinguished over time and eventually outlasted the Lusatian culture, which began to recede under pressure from foreign tribes. It is from the Milograd culture that we find the first brief mention of the Slavs by Greek sources, who referred to the people inhabiting this area as the Neuri. Herodotus in his work Histories, Book 4, describes the Neuri as such. The Neuri practiced the Scythian customs, and one generation before the expedition of Darius, it so befell them that they were forced to quit their land altogether by reason of serpents. For their land produced serpents in vast numbers, and they fell upon them in still larger numbers from the desert country above their borders, until at last, being hard-pressed, they left their own land and settled among the Budini. These men, it would seem, are wizards, for it is said of them by the Scythians and by the Hellenes who are settled in the Scythian lands, that once every year each of the Neuri becomes a wolf for a few days, and then returns to his original form. For my part, I do not believe them when they say this. He notes that all of the sources he has about the Neuri are second-hand and likely mythicized or embellished. However, the legend of the Neuri being forced to live in the lands of the Budini, a Scythian tribe who form the political elite of this area, likely represents some form of diplomatic relationship between the Neuri Slavs and the Scythians. The legend of the Neuri turning into wolves may come from their traditional practices similar to those of Koledari or Surva in modern Slavic populations, as many Slavs to celebrate the coming of New Year or certain other traditional or religious events often dressed as animals or in certain animal skins. It is also noted that during Darius's Persian invasion of Scythia in 513 BC, the Neuri refused the Scythian request for help. The events unfolded as follows. The Greeks of the Heloni and the Budini and the Saurumatae made a common cause and promised to help the Scythians, but the king of the Agathyrsi and the Neuri and the man-eaters and black-cloaked and Tauri made this answer to the messengers. Had it not been you who did unprovoked wrong to the Persians, and so began the war, this request that you proffer would seem right to us, and we would consent and act jointly with you. But now, you, and not we, invaded their land, and held it for such time as the god permitted, and the Persians, urged on by the same god, are but requiting you in the like manner. But we did these men no wrong in that former time, nor will we essay to harm them now unprovoked. Nevertheless, if the Persians come against our land too, and do the first act of wrong, then we will not consent to it, but till we see that, we will abide where we are by ourselves. For in our judgment, the Persians are attacking not us, but those at whose door lies the offense. This is a testament to the political independence of the Nuri Slavs from the Scythians, including from the Budini whose lands they had apparently moved into. It is likely, however, that there was occasional conflict between the Nuri and the Scythians, though Scythian military expeditions seem to have primarily been directed towards the western portion of the Lusatian culture. As we discussed in our previous episode, a large number of Scythian raids began in the 5th century, which devastated the western lands of the Lusatian culture and caused significant depopulation. After the initial destruction of Slavic settlements such as Biskupin by Scythian raiders, followed by over a century of further raids, Germanic and Celtic tribes began to migrate into the former lands of the Lusatian culture. Around 400 BC, due to overpopulation in Gaul, a large Celtic migration began towards the east, at which point the Boii, a Celtic tribe from Gaul, also migrated west into Czechia and displaced the remnants of the Lusatian culture which had survived the Scythian raids in the area. Another branch of the Boii, along with the Senones and Insubres, two other Celtic tribes, invaded Italy and sacked Rome in 390 BC. During the 4th and 3rd centuries, Celtic peoples swept the European stage and continued to raid and migrate to the south, which culminated in the invasion of Greece and the famous Battle of Thermopylae in 279 BC. Around the same time, Germanic tribes associated with the Jastorf culture apparently began migrating deeper into Poland, although exact timelines are not clear and they did not replace the native population. Rather, the Slavs, now represented by the Pomeranian culture, appear to have remained a majority, while Germans slowly continued to encroach and settle more and more. We find evidence of distinct burial practices continuing into the 1st century AD, as the Slavs cremated their dead and the encroaching Germans practiced inhumation, regular burials. While these primarily appeared later, we know that the Germanic Bastarnai had already completed their migration into modern Ukraine and Moldova by at least 233 BC, as they are mentioned there by Pompeius Trogus, and that the Germanic Sciri were also settled in the area and participated in an unsuccessful attack on the Greek city of Olbia, near modern Mykolaiv, before 220 BC, as an inscription from the city about a wealthy citizen called Protogenes, who helped in the defense of the city against the Sciri, is found from 220 BC. These groups migrated there from the Vistula basin, where they and other Germanic tribes had apparently established themselves already. The Germanic Bastarnai and the Sciri, along with perhaps other tribes, had begun encroaching on the territories traditionally inhabited by the Scythians, while the Sarmatians had begun to migrate west from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Ukraine. The Sarmatians had conquered and displaced the Scythians by 200 BC, other than some Scythian remnants in Dobruja and Crimea. However, the Sarmatians and Bastarnai, who settled west of the Dnieper, coexisted, with significant intermarriage between the two groups. They often worked together to conduct raids and attacks on Greek cities such as Olbia on the Black Sea coast, and later against the Roman Empire. Around this time, the Romans also began to expand north, and in 191 BC, the Romans conquered Bologna, causing the Italian Boii to retreat to Bohemia. In the following 2 centuries, the power of the Celts declined significantly. As the Dacian kingdom consolidated and pushed west, the Romans simultaneously pushed north, and the Germans continued migrating south. Eventually, around 8 BC, the weakened Boii in Bohemia were defeated, and the Germanic Marcomanni and Quadi occupied Czechia and part of Slovakia. This took place only 17 years before the Battle of Teutoburg Forest and the failed Roman conquest of Germany. But what was the fate of the Slavs in this period? From the encroachment of foreigners into the Slavic lands, as well as genetic evidence, we can infer that the Slavic population likely declined significantly from its high of over 1 million people during the Lusatian culture. Genetically, we can see that the Slavic population, at this point subdivided into 2 to 3 main subgroups, went through a genetic bottleneck. We can see this because the ratio of various pre-existing haplogroups within the population changes significantly. For example, while the R1a Z280 subclass of the R1a haplogroup had been dominant among Trzynets and Lusatian cultures, and continued to be so among the Nuri of the Milograd culture, haplogroup R1a M458, which was an existing smaller subclade in Proto-Slavic populations, became more pronounced among the Slavs in the Vistula. At the same time, haplogroup I2a also became dominant among a certain Slavic tribe whose location is unclear. The fact that individual people's reproductive success could have such a dramatic effect on the overall population in only a few centuries suggests that the Slavic tribes these haplogroup changes took place in were not very large. Of course, this is an expected consequence when we look at the massive migrations of Germans and Sarmatians into the Slavic lands, which almost certainly led to significant conflict and subjugation. František Palacký also comes to this conclusion from the study of some of the earliest written documents in the Czech language, where he says,
"It cannot be denied, however, that the Slavic peoples among their warlike and plundering neighbors, the Germans and Vlachs in the north and west, the Scythians and Sarmatians in the east, had to endure many pressures for centuries. Many a tribe of theirs having been conquered, especially by the German Goths and the Sarmatian Alans and the Lusatians, often tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes unhappily, to throw off the yoke of slavery and expel the oppressors from the homeland. The memory of such battles still echoes in the oldest legends, although there is nothing definite about it."
The Milograd culture, characterized by hill forts, was destroyed concurrently with the Sarmatian invasion of Scythia and was replaced by the Zarubinci culture, which saw the expansion of smaller, unfortified rural settlements outside of the main Slavic hill forts. This could be a result of a tribute system being established, with the Slavs being independent from the Scythians and therefore having to fortify themselves for protection, while in the Zarubinci culture it is possible that a stable tribute system ended the constant threat of raids. This stability and ability to spread out from cramped hill forts may have also contributed to the end of Slavic population decline through reducing war deaths and increasing fertility rates. Unfortunately, no written records survive about this period to confirm these theories. In the West, the situation was much more precarious. Migrating Germanic tribes and pre-existing Slavic tribes had likely coexisted in the territory of Poland for centuries, with Slavs possibly maintaining the political independence that they previously had. However, this changed as more and more Germanic tribes entered Poland over time. In the 3rd century BC, the Vandals entered Poland, and we see a shift in the archaeological record. Previously, archaeological artifacts were predominantly associated with the Slavic Pomeranian culture. However, after this, as the Vandals entered Poland with more advanced technology picked up from contact and trade with the Latin-influenced Celts in the west, there appears to have been a demographic shift as Vandals became dominant in Poland. The artifacts found from this Vandal period are known as the Przeworsk culture. A further large wave of Germanic settlers arrived in the 1st century AD with the Gothic migrations, and these Gothic migrants, along with other Germanic tribes such as the Suevian Gepins, established the Wilbacher culture. Writing centuries later, Jordanes, a Hellenized Goth living in the Roman Empire, says that the Goths migrated from Scandinavia into Poland under their first king Berig. How the Goths, Suevi, Vandals and other Germanic tribes interacted is not exactly clear, and the position of Slavs at this point even less so. In his work Natural Histories, published in 79 AD, Pliny the Elder described the national situation east of the Vistula River. Some writers state that these regions, as far as the river Vistula, are inhabited by the Sarmatians, the Venedi, the Siri, and the Hiri, and that there is a gulf there known by the name of Silipenus, at the mouth of which is the island of Latris, after which comes another gulf, that of Lagnus, which borders on the Cimbri.
The Hiri were another Germanic tribe similar to the Siri, and the Cimbri were those inhabiting Jutland at the time. 2 decades later, in his book Germania, Tacitus described the people living beyond the Marcomanni, the inhabitants of Czechia, and the Quadi, the inhabitants of Slovakia. First he mentions the Lygians, living west of the Vistula, and then he describes those beyond Ligurium. He says,
Here Suevia ends. I do not know whether to class the tribes of the Piazzuni, Venedi, and Fenni with the Germans or with the Sarmatians. The Piazzuni, however, who are sometimes called Bastarnae, are like Germans in their language, manner of life, and mode of settlement and habitation. Squalor is universal among them, and their nobles are indolent. Mixed marriages are giving them something of the repulsive appearance of the Sarmatians. The Venedi have adopted many Sarmatian habits, for their plundering forays take them over all of the wooded and mountainous highlands that lie between the Piazzuni and the Fenni. Nevertheless, they are on the whole to be classed as Germans, for they have settled homes, carry shields, and are fond of traveling, and travel fast on foot, differing in all of these respects from the Sarmatians, who live in wagons or on horseback.
At this time, the term Veneti was likely used to describe all Slavic peoples, coming from the German word Vend, which was used for millennia to describe Slavs. The Slavs of the Zarubinski culture, however, were usually described specifically as Antas, while later authors like Jordanes used the term Veneti only to describe Western Slavs. The Fenni described by Tacitus may have also been Finnic people who lived beyond the Slavic lands, as the Germans referred to hunter-gatherers as Finner. The Slavs of this period lived through major shifts around them, affected by the same events which would decide the fate of ancient Rome, but from the opposite side of Europe. At some point around 200 AD, some subsection of the Goths migrated from the Vistula basin into Ukraine, conquering the Sarmatians and establishing the Chernyakhov culture. How exactly this happened is not quite clear, but the Goths seem to have subjugated the Sarmatians and Bastarnae. In 238 AD, they are first mentioned by Roman historius Publius Herennius Dexipius, as they crossed the Roman frontier and sacked the city of Histria in North Dobruja. A few decades after this, they seized the Roman client kingdom of the Bosporus, which occupied the Kerch Straits and was the last remnant of the Scythians. As the Goths and Gepids concentrated closer to Crimea and the Roman frontier, Slavs referred to as the Antas began to migrate southwards from the Pripyat marshes and to occupy the largely uninhabited territories that they found. How this took place in relation to the Goths, who may have claimed this territory, is not clear, as the historical record is focused more on the interactions between the Goths, Gepids, and other Germanic tribes with the Romans on the Danubian frontier. František Palacký tells us about this period.
After a long struggle with the Goths in their original homeland, some Slavic tribes were finally subdued around the year 250 by the warlike Ermanaric, the Gothic king. However, his dominance did not last long, for already in the year 375, as mentioned above, the Huns invaded Europe. By them the power and the government of the Goths was shattered. Ermanaric, having been defeated, pierced himself with his sword, and his people fled to the southwestern regions. There can be little doubt that the Huns, whom contemporary writers describe to us as no less clever than savage, knowing the hatred that had been already arisen between the Germans and the Slavs, used it to their advantage in such way that, having united with the latter as the weaker, They overpower the Germans and then rule both nations together.
The origin of the Huns is attributed to the Turkic Xiongnu Confederation in modern Mongolia. This confederation was defeated by the ancestors of modern Mongolians, who with Chinese help migrated from Manchuria into Mongolia and pushed these proto-Turkic peoples west. Many centuries later, some of the descendants of the Huns, located around the modern Altai Republic in Russia, formed a horde and moved westwards. The nature of this horde, as with many later steppe hordes, was to compel other steppe tribes around them to join the horde or to become vassals or tributaries of the horde, and then to continue the pattern until eventually moving on to raiding and pillaging agricultural societies who they would attempt to extract annual tributes from. The Hunnic horde attacked Europe around the middle of the 4th century AD, and their first target was the Sarmatian Alans on the Pontic Caspian steppe. Some Alans submitted to the Huns, while others fled west and continued their armed resistance. Eventually, those Alans who did not want to submit to the Huns were all pushed into the lands of the Greuthungi Ostrogoths. At this point, the Huns had captured the whole Pontic Caspian steppe and subjugated or pushed out all of the Sarmatian tribes. It was after this in 375 when they first became known to Europe with their attacks on the Greuthungi. In 376, the Greuthungi, alongside some Alans who had escaped Hunnic rule, were decisively defeated, and their king Ermanaric committed suicide. After this, most Greuthungi became Hunnic vassals, though a small group fled over the Danube, and these were joined by the larger part of the Tervingi Goths under Fritigern who fled over the Danube to form the Visigoths. A smaller group of Tervingi under Athanaric remained north of the Danube to fight the Huns, but these were also defeated, and Athanaric fled to Constantinople in 381. These events led to the Gothic Wars in the Roman Empire, and in the subsequent Hunnic consolidation of Central Europe. Large numbers of Germanic refugees, along with some Alan refugees from further east who did not want to accept Hunnic overlordship, fled into the Western Roman Empire, notably during Radagaisus' invasion of Italy and during the 406 Rhine crossing. These events led to significant depopulation among the Germanic population of Central Europe, and was only exacerbated by the long-term consequences of Hun rule. Hunnic raids into the Eastern Roman Empire devastated the population of the Balkans and left vast rural areas uninhabited, while also taking a toll on the Germanic subject peoples of the Huns who were levied to participate in these raids. The battle at the Catalonian plains in northern France resulted in tens of thousands more Germanic peoples being killed. At the same time, the Huns who refused to practice agriculture forced the Germanic subjects they had to pay them heavy agricultural tributes. As Priscus noted,
For these men have no concern for agriculture, but like wolves, attack and steal the Goths' food supplies, with the result that the latter remains in the position of servants and themselves suffer food shortages. The combination of food shortages and male mortality decimated the Germanic population, while most numerous Germanic nations east of the Elbe, such as the Lombards and the Gepids, lived along the Danube on the Roman frontier. At the same time, the Slavic Antas and Veneti seem to have avoided extensive contact with the Huns, as they are not mentioned in any battles of the Roman Hunnic wars on either side. The swampy and forested terrain, lack of infrastructure like roads, and absence of major grasslands likely made the Slavic lands a much more difficult target for the Huns. It's unlikely that the Slavs would have challenged the Huns in any major pitched battles, but the scattered Slavic hill forts would have likely taken more time than they were worth to conquer, especially if the Slavs refused to surrender, as the most valuable prize for the Huns in such an endeavour would be the capture of slaves. At the same time, in more outlying Slavic villages,
it would have perhaps been easy for local inhabitants to disperse or destroy their grain supplies and flee their villages into the dense forest and swamps of the Pripyat region. It's possible that some Slavs paid tribute to the Huns to avoid raiding and harassment, but this tribute, if extracted, was likely of a much smaller quantity than what the Germans were subjected to, and the Slavic population in this period was able to continue its rapid growth while the rest of Europe fell into chaos. Eventually, the Gepids, along with other Germanic peoples living along the Danube, defeated the Huns at the Battle of Nadao. This forced the Huns out of Central Europe and limited them to a small rump state in Ukraine. As Procopius said,
In the old days, many Huns, called the Cimmerians, inhabited the lands I already mentioned. They all had a single king. Once one of their kings had two sons, one called Utigur and another called Kutrigur, and after their father's death, they shared the power and gave their names to the subjected peoples, so that even nowadays some of them are called Utigurs and others Kutrigurs.
while these Hunnic remnants appear to have inhabited central and eastern Ukraine, Galicia appears to have fallen to the Slavs after the Germanic defeat of the Huns at the Battle of Nadao. The Slavs soon after this consolidated their hold by expanding into what would later become Moldavia and Wallachia. Finally, the last Hunnic remnants in Ukraine were destroyed as migrating Avars and Gokturks from Asia flooded the Eurasian steppe in the middle of the 5th century. Around the same time, the Slavs from their base around western Ukraine and southern Belarus then appear to have expanded to the west and east, and then finally to the south, in a sweeping series of migrations that we will cover in our next video on this series. Subscribe to find our content again.